If you were losing a war, would you release a video like this?
No, that's bull. That's nonsense. We need some fresh ideas. Better, stronger, and effective. Oh, God, I'm so tired.
International.
Who would have thought? I thought these people were losing the war. But no, they got time to make propaganda videos that are pretty good, actually.
The problem is, Ramon, that these sanctions have gone on for some time. And let's face it, we've all seen the videos where the Russians are basically burning gas in their house to heat their home. And it's costing them like peanuts. Whilst Western Europe is complaining they can't heat their home because they've got no gas. And if they do use the gas, it's going to cost them thousands and thousands of euros, or in some instances pounds. So these sanctions have been applied against the Russian economy in order to stop their war in Ukraine. It hasn't really worked. In fact, the actual sanctions now have a reverse effect. The Russian economy has grown. Western Europe has not. Western Europe is in recession. The Russian economy is not. So these sanctions ultimately have been self-imposed sanctions on Western forces. So from the Russians' perspective, it's very difficult not to make fun of the European Union and any of the other forces that have banned the Russians. They haven't worked against the party being sanctioned. They've worked upon the people imposing the sanctions.
Yeah, very much so. I think sanctions work against like Libya or Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, they haven't worked against Iran for the past 40 years. But I think what Russia is showing the world, and especially the world that is becoming multipolar and maybe doesn't want to fall within the ambit of globalization, the American-backed version, of course, is that your country can actually work quite well without the US dollar, without US companies, and sort of being banned from the SWIFT system and things like that. I think it's a very important lesson that Russia is teaching the world. How long it can last, I don't actually know, but I am rather surprised at how resilient and robust the Russians are, based on the greatest sanctions package the world has ever seen. And yet they seem to be shrugging it off quite well, finding new opportunities to sell their stuff, and life goes on, really. It's quite amazing.
Life does go on, and I suppose this is actually the moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen. Moral of the story is that sometimes when you apply a global order and you give a central command, the problem is that when there is a shock to the central command or the central order, it basically filtrates down to everyone. When you are a pocket on your own, a country on your own, you can weather the storms because you are your own entity. Ramon, unfortunately, we did actually see this during apartheid. As you may recall, the Nats were sanctioned into oblivion, but the South African economy still remained robust, and we didn't have the level of unemployment that we do now. Any shock that we now have in the United States, or even in the European order, ultimately filtrates through to South Africa, in terms of the bond markets, in terms of currency fluctuations, exports, imports, tariffs, and so forth. Russia doesn't have this problem because it has decoupled itself from the global order. So you, ladies and gentlemen, are left to ask the question, has these sanctions damaged Russia or damaged the West? Is Russia suffering from being excluded or thriving from being excluded? And if the answer to both of those is that Russia's come out on top, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we gain by staying in the global order?
That is exceedingly true, Byron. What do we gain? For now, the global order is like 60% of our exports, but I don't see why we can't change that over to China and Russia. But we'll only know for sure when the war's actually over. Donald Trump comes back to power. He enforces the Minsk Agreement, which means that half of Ukraine will become independent states or part of the Russian Federation, and essentially Russia will win that particular war. Will all those sanctions be lifted afterwards? I sincerely doubt it, but I think the longer the sanctions stay, the greater the opportunity for de-dollarization and the greater the opportunity for BRICS is to be a viable opponent of Western influence. So by Trump trying to end the war sooner rather than later, he's actually saving American hegemony rather than anything else. But for Biden, the guy is so senile, he thinks he can crush Russia. That is just not the case.
You may look at this video and say, you guys are just there for the Putin forces. To be clear, my own personal form of analysis on this is that I do not think that American supremacy will disappear within the next 100 years. The Americans will remain top of the game for the next 100 years. They are the largest economy, and that's not going anywhere. The largest economy is really determined by military might, and the Americans still have the largest military in the world. Their military spending, far exceeds everything everybody else is able to do combined. They are still the global force, and they will remain the global force for some time. But what this should do is leave us with questions of how we, as a world, want to restructure the global order. Trump gives the opportunity to the world to realign itself, to renegotiate the way that the global order is put together, and the world should ask the question, how do we want a future world to look? Do we want it to look like one unified force where everything's controlled centrally, or do we want countries to have their own identities, like Russia has shown? An identity of its own means that it's robust, it's resilient, and doesn't really falter at the shocks of others.
And as for South Africa, we have always said we choose a South Africa first foreign policy. We will be friends with whoever can help South Africa prosper, whether it be Russia, whether it be China, whether it be America, whether it be Argentina. We don't actually care. And I think the special military operation in Ukraine is showing that South Africa can actually be quite an important player in global politics, quite an important player in sort of geopolitics. We just need a different government because the current one is so useless that, we will lose this opportunity.